Good evening. Thanks for coming. I'm Natasha Udensiva. I'm a lecturer in international affairs here in SIPA and also a faculty advisor to the Capstone workshop. It's my pleasure to introduce today James Henderson, who is a wonderful scholar and writer, and currently he's a senior fellow at the Oxford Energy Institute. He's also bringing to the table great oil and gas industry experience. He was an investment banker. He was commercial directing, and also in consulting. You actually can see his working papers at the website of the Oxford Energy Institute. But here today, James is going to talk about his new published book, International Partnership and the Future of Russian Oil and Gas. And I want you to welcome James Henderson, and the floor is yours.
Natasha, thank you very much for that introduction. And
that's, by the way, the book. I'm very sorry. This is the book.
Yes, the first and last bit of brazen marketing. So thank you very much for turning up this evening and taking some time to talk about the Russian energy industry. Interestingly, this book was written, well, it took 10 years in the making. It's my PhD thesis, which has been turned into a book in partnership with a gentleman, Alistair Ferguson, who has worked in the Russian oil and gas industry for TNKBP for 8 years and for other companies for the subsequent 4 years since he left TNKBP. So hopefully it combines a bit of theoretical and academic rigor with some practical experience and some rather interesting stories about life in the Russian oil and gas industry. And it was published just before the current Ukraine crisis. And so what was intended as a kind of introduction and history of international partnership and some thoughts on how foreign companies might want to interact with Russia going forward, it's turned into a rather more of a analysis of what international companies are doing in Russia, and has prompted a lot of questions about what sanctions might be imposed on the energy industry and how international companies might be prevented from working in Russia going forward. So we can certainly talk about those issues in the Q&A. What I want to talk about, to put it into context, is some of the current issues for the Russian oil sector as it currently stands, where international companies are currently participating, what they're doing, go through some of the major areas where Russia is developing its industry in partnership with international oil companies, look at some of the challenges of working with Russian companies in the Russian business environment, and then provide some thoughts on how foreign companies, if they do intend to stay, are allowed to stay and want to develop their business going forward, how they can address some of the risks. So I just want to start by drawing a distinction when one talks about hydrocarbons in Russia between oil and gas in particular, because they do have rather distinct roles, and oil is very much the revenue generator. You can see from these three pie charts, which have actually been produced by Rostat, the contribution to GDP is almost double from the oil sector to the gas sector. The share in exports revenues is 54% for oil, 12% for gas, and perhaps most importantly of all, when it comes to the Russian budgetary revenues, tax revenues, the oil sector contributes 42% of revenues, and the gas sector only 6% of revenues. And this was actually an issue that was picked up by President Putin in a recent phone-in, which he has on a sort of relatively regular basis, so he can talk to the people. And he was asked the question about whether sanctions and the possible loss of gas sales into Ukraine and Europe would hurt Russia, and he kind of laughed it off and pointed to these statistics and said, gas is really just a drop in the ocean compared to oil, and they're not going to hit our oil production because they need the oil too badly. So essentially, oil has this role as a revenue provider, which is interesting because although it's clearly a strength to have the amount of oil production that Russia has, 10.5 million barrels a day, it's also becoming a bit of an issue because we've reached a point in the Russian oil industry where we are moving from the development and production from Soviet-era assets, the vast supergiant fields in Siberia in particular, that were producing about 11 million barrels a day when the Soviet Union ended, collapsed during the 1990s due to lack of investment, recovered during the 2000s particularly, and rediscovered their sort of Soviet-era levels of 10 to 10.5 million barrels a day towards the end of the 20 zeros, if you like. But now, and these are forecasts from the Ministry of Energy and their general scheme of development of the oil industry to 2020, of what could happen to Russian oil production. And you can see that there's one scenario which takes a nosedive rather dramatically from the current levels down to, perhaps even as low as 4.5 million barrels a day by 2030. And there's another forecast, which is rather more optimistic, which shows 10.5 million barrels a day being sustained to 2020 and then a slight decline. And then there's the IEA forecast, which is their assessment of what could happen if various new greenfield areas of Russia are developed. And I've just highlighted, in rough order, what those new things might be. Enhanced oil recovery is the use of increasingly sophisticated techniques to keep current reservoirs producing at high levels. East Siberia, obviously, is a region of Russia which is somewhat remote from the core areas and needs significantly money spent and has somewhat more difficult geology. Tight, unconventional oil is one of the current topics of interest in the Russian oil industry and is being looked at in partnership with Rosneft, particularly by international oil companies. Offshore in the Black Sea and the Barents Sea, and then particularly interestingly offshore in the Arctic, are other areas that could sustain Russian oil production at its current levels. But the interesting thing about all these new elements is that they require sophisticated technology that in some instances hasn't been used in Russia before, requires a lot of money, and often requires management and experience, which Russian companies are still developing and don't yet have in significant amounts. The other problem the Russian oil sector has got is a tax problem. I've mentioned that taxes from the oil sector contribute 42% of budget revenues. That is inevitably going to decline almost whatever happens to production or the oil price, because to incentivize the development of new areas, tax incentives have had to be offered, reductions in the tax burden for various types of fields. And you can see here that what the red line shows is the share of production to which these tax incentives do not apply is falling from well over 90%, 95% in 2007 to an anticipated around 70% by 2015. And so, tax receipts are going to go down because the production that's coming on stream is just being taxed at a lower level. So if you combine that with the possibility that production could also go into decline if the new things I've talked about don't come on stream, then you have what has historically been a strength potentially becoming a weakness for Russia. Now, the gas sector is facing some rather different challenges. It's certainly not a production challenge or a supply challenge in Russia. If anything, they've got far too much gas and have developed fields that aren't needed because what has happened since 2008, for a variety of reasons, is that the global gas industry has become much more competitive. The catalysts for that change have been US unconventionals, which has meant that gas, which was originally intended for the US in the form of LNG, has been rediverted to other markets, particularly Europe. Also rediverted or exported from the US has been cheap coal, which has replaced gas in Europe. At the same time, European demand for gas and energy generally has stagnated following the economic crisis in 2008 and 2009. And on top of that, oil prices have been rising, and the price of Russian gas in Europe is linked to oil prices historically. And so Russian gas has become uncompetitive as well. And all those factors have led to what you can see at the top, which is Gazprom's production going into decline from 2008 to 2012 and staying at that level in 2013. In the meantime, interestingly, in the domestic market, Gazprom's also been undermined by domestic competitors. And unfortunately for Gazprom, just prior to all this happening, it took the decision to develop a huge new resource base on the Yamal Peninsula in the northern part of Siberia. So it is developing a massive new field at a time when demand for its gas has gone into decline. Hence, the need for the Russian gas sector to adapt to a new role in a more competitive market. And that role is increasingly taking, or increasingly becoming interested in the development of LNG, liquefied natural gas projects, which allows Russia, and Gazprom in particular, to be more flexible in where it sells its gas. But again, that involves new technology, which Russia hasn't been exposed to very much. And all the while, I've talked about the potential decline in oil tax revenues. The Russian gas sector, which has essentially always historically been very much a kind of political tool and not a revenue-generating tool, is facing the fact that it is actually going to have to probably generate more budget revenues over time as well. So an awkward situation for the Russian gas sector, not to do with supply, but to do with whether there's a demand for gas, particularly from Gazprom. And, you know, this graph at the bottom just shows an estimate of what the oversupply situation is. You know, potentially 150 billion cubic meters of too much gas by 2030. Having said that, you know, the geography of Russia means that it sits right at the heart of the global gas market between the two biggest importing regions, Europe and Asia. So, you know, Russia is in a competitive position. It needs to adjust its marketing strategy for gas, its pricing, and we're starting to see that evolve. But, you know, within that evolution into the global gas market, partnership, which has never been one of Gazprom's strengths, is becoming more important. Partnership, obviously, with international companies. So, again, an international theme in the gas sector for slightly different reasons. So, you know, talking about international companies in Russia, I just wanted to show one chart charting the history of international involvement and what we've seen as the Russian oil and gas sector has developed. So initially in the early 1990s, talked about the collapse. The line, the area is Russian oil production, and you can see the steep decline from about 11 million barrels a day in the late 80s in the Soviet Union down to around 6 million barrels a day by the mid-1990s. And what was required then and what was sought by President Yeltsin was technology and finance from international companies to help stem that decline. So partnerships were formed, joint ventures, and 3 production sharing agreements with Shell, Exxon, Total, Statoil, and others to the fore. But then what happened was that despite the initial cooperation between foreign partners and Russian companies, as the Russian oil sector became corporatized and then privatized, foreign companies actually became competition for these new assets. And suddenly they weren't wanted around so much because they were bidding up the prices for Russian assets. And we had an era when there was some significant disenfranchisement, if you like, of international participation in joint ventures. A number of horror stories of you know, the awkward business environment being turned against international companies. And we saw a big retreat, which was accelerated by the financial crisis in 1998. There was then a process of consolidation of the Russian oil industry when the buyers of the assets during the privatization process went through a process of bringing together all the subsidiaries under the larger vertically integrated companies in the sector, which caused a number of governance issues, particularly for minority shareholders, and again kept IOCs away. But once that consolidation process had been completed, then there was an attempt to entice international companies back by offering them equity in various companies, and perhaps BP's investment in TNK-BP is the best example of that. Then we saw a period of increased state control, the emergence of Rosneft in particular as a major player in the oil and gas sector. And finally, we've got back to, if you like, where we were in the early 1990s, with foreign companies now being needed to provide technology and finance again as we go into this new era of development of the Russian oil sector. So if you like, we've gone through a very turbulent period from cooperation in the early 1990s through a period where there was significant competition and disenfranchisement of international companies, through crisis, consolidation, and now the formation of joint ventures again. So where are we right now? Well, this just shows some examples, all the major examples I could think of what international companies are up to in Russia. And there's one common theme really through all these, is that they're all at very early stages of development. So they're either exploration, or they are early stage pilot projects, or they are kind of explorations, if you like, of partnership opportunities, such as in the Arctic. There are actually two exceptions to that rule. One is Sakhalin, where Exxon and Shell have developed two PSAs there since the early 1990s, and the other is the Wintershall and E.ON gas joint venture with Gazprom, which is actually producing, but all the others are right at the early stages. So if you like, at the point that we were in the 1990s when international companies first went into Russia. But you can see that many of the major international players are in Russia, mainly partnering with state companies. Gazprom Neft, its oil subsidiary, and Rosneft being by far the majority of the partnerships, although there is one with Novatek as well. And you can see at the bottom, there are two significant equity stakes that have been taken by BP in Rosneft and by Total in Novatek, both minority stakes with some element of influence, but certainly no control. And we can perhaps talk about the difference between equity participation and joint ventures in Q&A. Now, what are these partnerships doing? I'm just going to go through a few examples of the value added. The first is more enhanced oil recovery, and this is, as I mentioned earlier, the development of new techniques to sustain production from existing fields, everything from improved reservoir management, improved water flooding, to chemical injection, to the use of heat. And you can see that this is important because, according to various commentators at least, well over half of Russia's reserves are now in the kind of difficult to recover category, and around half its production is now coming from fields that are not the easy Soviet-era fields. So it's becoming increasingly important that this enhanced oil recovery techniques are implemented. This doesn't just come from international oil companies, of course, it comes from service companies as well, like Schlumberger and Halliburton. But nevertheless, it's an important short-term contribution, if you like, of international technology and techniques. And the IEA, well, I've shown an estimate here that new techniques could add 500,000 barrels a day by 2030. There's about, let me think, 4 billion tons worth of reserves that they estimate could be accessed by enhanced oil recovery techniques in existing fields. So that's what 30 billion barrels of oil. So a lot of potential from this technique. More looking to the short to the medium term, tight oil developments in Russia are a very exciting sort of new prospect. The United States Geological Survey estimates that Russia contains 75 billion barrels of unconventional oil reserves. It's the largest potential resource base in the world. A layer called the Bazhenov Shale is causing particular excitement at the moment, and joint ventures between the companies I've put on the slide are all looking to explore that layer and other of the tighter geological formations that have yet to be fully exploited in Russia. And you can see that the potential contribution to Russia's oil production could be as high as 1.5 million barrels a day within 15 years or so. So significant contribution potentially. There are a lot of issues to be resolved. There are technical issues that are being addressed by pilot projects right now. There are going to be tax issues, and there will most likely be issues of capacity in the service industry as the numbers of wells that need to be drilled are started probably towards the end of this decade. So those factors, allied with the fact that the corporate environment in Russia is not exactly the same as the corporate environment that got unconventional going in the US, means that this is by no means a certainty, and it certainly won't happen without international involvement. Neither will exploration of the Arctic, which is probably the most exciting thing that's going to happen this year, because ExxonMobil and Rosneft are going to drill by far the most expensive well that Russia has ever seen. It's going to cost $750 million, funded entirely by Exxon in the South Kara Sea. And Russia has some offshore experience, limited in the Caspian Sea, a little bit in the Barents, but effectively this is a big step out for Rosneft in particular. The upside is potentially enormous. I mean, the prospect they're drilling in the South Kara Sea could have 7 billion barrels of oil on its own. The graph at the bottom shows estimates of potential output from the Arctic, which could reach 1 million barrels a day, but it probably won't until the end of the next decade, given the difficulties of the environment, the costs involved, and the fact that there's a lot of environmental issues that will need to be addressed, as well as development issues and provision of extraordinarily complex rigs and drilling equipment. However, it is going to be vital to Russia's long-term production profile, and so another area where international companies are making a pretty vital contribution to Russia's oil future. Less exciting geologically, but more exciting politically, is the Black Sea, where obviously there's been a change of ownership in the Crimea, if I can put it like that, but where Russian interests in the region are again expressed in two joint ventures, one with ExxonMobil and one with Eni, with Rosneft. And the participation there, I think, is now increasingly about the politics and about the involvement in a geopolitically sensitive area, rather than necessarily the potential for oil discoveries, although there are estimates that multi-billion barrels of oil could lie below the Russian sector. And the other interesting international involvement and controversial involvement in the Black Sea, of course, is the construction of the South Stream pipeline, which is the gas pipeline that is looking to circumvent Ukraine, provide what the Russians would see as security of supply of Russian gas to Europe, but which Europe is increasingly viewing as yet more potential dominance of Russian gas in its energy mix. And so there is an ongoing debate about approvals for certainly the onshore pipelines in Europe that will be necessary to move gas away from South Stream. But nevertheless, Russia and Gazprom seem determined to move ahead with the project, and they're being backed, as you can see, by three pretty important European companies. So again, foreign involvement in a core project for the Russian oil and gas sector. Of course, so far I've really talked about Western partners, because that historically has been the focus. It's been Western majors that have spent a lot of time thinking about Russia, but now, driven by the growth of the market in the East, but also politically now by the search for diversity of markets for political purposes, Eastern Partnership is becoming increasingly important. In the oil sector, already Russia is supplying significant hydrocarbons to China and to the Pacific via the pipeline called the East Siberia Pacific Ocean Pipeline, and the graph at the top just shows you what the capacity of that pipeline is likely to be. It's being expanded now to 1 million barrels a day and could soon be more than 1.5 million barrels a day, and certainly the oil is available to fill that pipeline in the east. And the most recent thing that's happened, of course, is the deal between Gazprom and CNPC to export gas via a new pipeline that will run from Irkutsk and Yakutia in the west all the way across to the Pacific coast at Vladivostok, and with a spur down to China around 2,500 kilometers along the pipeline at Blagoveshchensk. And this is the foundation for Russia's expansion of hydrocarbons in the east and the development of the domestic economy even, but will obviously play a big role in increasing partnership with Chinese companies. And already there's talk of CNPC and Chinese companies providing up to $25 billion financing for the development of the fields that will produce the gas and the development of the pipeline that will send the gas into China. So a new area for partnership in the east, with potential opportunities for international oil companies as well, but to date, limited. The other gas theme, to build on the eastern kind of direction that Russia is moving in, is LNG. And again, you can see that foreign companies are involved in all the partnerships, the LNG partnerships that are currently being either on stream or being actively discussed. And certainly the technology that's required, at the moment at least, does necessitate some international involvement. Shell was instrumental at the development of the Sakhalin-2 project, which came online in 2009. Although Gazprom now control that project, Shell were absolutely the operator who got the project done. ExxonMobil will be instrumental in development of Sakhalin-1 LNG as and when it occurs, and Total's involvement in Novatek's Yamal LNG is again seen as vital, not just to the technology and the management of the project, but also to the raising of finance for the project too, with its experience in the sector. Interestingly as well, foreign companies have been active participants in the development of what is becoming an increasing challenge to Gazprom, which is non-Gazprom companies entering the gas export market in competition with Gazprom. So it's interesting that not only are international companies at the heart of the development of a new strand in Russia's gas strategy, they're also at the heart of the increasing competition between Gazprom and its domestic peer group, which is one of the major themes of the Russian gas sector at the moment. I've mentioned financing in pretty much all the projects I've talked about so far, but just to mention, it is at the moment the key issue for the development of the Russian oil and gas sector, and it's the one thing that is really worrying both companies and the government, which is how will they finance the $2 trillion of investment that the IEA estimate is needed to be invested in the sector to 2035, and in the short term, how will they refinance some of the debt they've already raised, in particular Rosneft, which is going to need to refinance around $40 billion of debt this year, and also how will they raise the project financing for projects that are being planned right now, with Yamal LNG being at the head of that list, when banks are already nervous about extending too many loans in case more sanctions get imposed. So financing is becoming a key issue in terms of the partnership with foreign companies. I've talked a lot about the opportunities for international companies in Russia, and it looks like, politics apart, there is an increasing role for international companies to play in the development of what is one of the world's biggest hydrocarbon resource bases, and which is a hydrocarbon resource base that historically has welcomed international investment much more than other hydrocarbon resource countries such as in the Middle East. However, it obviously does come with its own challenges, and this picture was put together by my co-author Alistair to try and describe his experiences in living within the Russian oil and gas industry in a joint venture. We called it the triangle of tension, and what it tries to encapsulate in a picture is the difficulty of understanding and operating within a business environment where you have to try and find alignment and balance between not just the commercial aspects of any deal you do, but the political implications of any deal you do, and how politicians are thinking about your business, and then the vested interests that have some kind of cash flow interest or other interest in what you are doing, either directly or indirectly, which make it a very difficult place to do business, particularly because the institutional environment within which all this is happening is remarkably weak, and where you cannot rely on the judicial and legislative systems to necessarily support you, and where you also have to understand the vast kind of matrix, if you like, of relationships that have been built up over many, many years between domestic entrepreneurs and politicians, and the way they do deals. So, to put a little bit more detail on that complex kind of triangle, if you like, the way we kind of describe it as all the words that I put up here. Factional, tribal is another word that Alistair has used. Conflict is an everyday part of the process of doing business in Russia. It's a very win-lose environment. And I think it's interesting to comment, rather than just reading out all these words, to comment that partnership in Russia was not a concept that you really saw very much of at all until very recently. Never mind with international companies, but domestically. When I lived in Russia in 1997 to 2002, I came from an oil industry where partnership is just absolutely the norm. If you operate in the North Sea or in the US or almost anywhere in the world, if you go to develop an oil field, you'd always do it with one operator and then a number of equity participants to share the risk, both financial and operational. But in Russia, the experience very much is that if you have an asset and you control it, you want to absolutely control it 100%. You don't want to share it with anyone. And the concept of selling down any of your portfolio to try and expand it by buying bits of somebody else's portfolio was just a complete non-starter. And I think that, if you like, mentality reflected the difficulty of doing business. And I guess the question is why? And the answer is because one of the key attributes of being an entrepreneur in Russia is your local knowledge of how to get things done, and that's a very competitive process. It's the competition of your links and your contacts and your influence versus somebody else's, and you don't want to share that at all. And what I try to do in my thesis, and what I've tried to do on this chart, is to try and explain why that's a perfectly logical commercial reaction. And I've tried to do that in the context of Dunning's eclectic paradigm, which provides a picture of the motivations for foreign direct investment. And essentially it says that, as a foreigner, you come with certain skills. In the case of the Russian oil industry, your technology and your management expertise, and you come to a country which is the location, the host country, which has, in the case of the oil and gas industry, the geographical advantage of having oil and gas reserves within its borders. And you put those together in a deal, and initially both parties are satisfied because the host country tends to need the foreigner with his skills, and the foreigner clearly needs access. But over time, if you examine resource sector theories, that bargain starts to obsolesce, because as the foreign partner makes his contribution, as he spends his cash, as the field comes towards development, the host country starts to think the risks are diminishing here and I need a bigger return. I want to increase the tax. I want to perhaps reduce the foreign partner equity share in this thing, in this field. And the foreign partner then relies on the legal contracts he's signed, and also on the fact that he tries to internalize his skill sets within his own subsidiaries, not to share them too much. And that process can kind of work in balance, where you find a kind of suitable alignment of interests. Now, that works in an environment where there's a strong institutional framework, strong contractual framework, but in a weak institutional environment, like I have argued and will argue Russia was and still is, you need, as we've seen, foreign partners turn to domestic partners to guide them, to protect them through the asymmetries of the business environment. And
clarification. Sure. Weak state or weak rule of law institutions?
A weak institutional environment. Weak institutional environment, yeah. So you essentially, your partners guide you through this, but obviously they bring their bargaining skill to the table, and their bargaining skill is the local knowledge of how to get that done, how to navigate through the informal processes that are part of a weak institutional environment. And they essentially then are in a bargaining process as they form a joint venture. The foreign partner's bringing his skills, the domestic partner's bringing his skills, and we argue in the book, and we argue from joint venture theory, that partnership then becomes a competition for knowledge, and that the domestic partner is incentivized to protect his own knowledge base, to try and learn the foreign partner skills, and he is incentivized to continue to maintain the environment within which he is strong, namely the weak institutional environment. And what we've seen, I think, is a maintenance of that status quo throughout the 20 years of Russia's post-Soviet history, with various nuances, of course. But essentially, it then becomes a very logical process for the domestic partner to try and enhance his own position by maintaining the weak institutional environment and by maintaining his own local knowledge. And so you have essentially this competition going on, and what I found in my research when I kind of came up with this kind of concept, if you like, the idea was to go and investigate it and to see whether there was any grounding for it in reality. So I studied 4 joint ventures that were formed in the 1990s and found that what the foreign partners told me, at least, was that they brought their skills, as you'd expect. They looked for domestic partners who could help them access assets and weave them through the maze of the Russian business environment. That indeed this transfer of knowledge was going on, but it was the Russians who were learning rather rapidly, and that in most cases the foreigners continued to rely on their domestic partner without concern, but then found that once their skills had been transferred, the domestic partner would very often turn against them and use their local knowledge against them. And this caused a lot of the conflict in joint ventures. And then to follow up the thesis and to prepare for the book, I interviewed a lot of people in the 2000s who confirmed essentially that they felt that the business environment hadn't changed at all, that the institutions remain weak, and that, if you like, the status quo is unlikely to change while it benefits so many vested interests, and that, as a result, local knowledge and influence remain absolutely vital to the whole process. And to kind of back up that subjective analysis, I won't talk you through extensively through a survey I did, but I surveyed many foreign partnerships in Russia to ask them how their partnerships developed, what they felt was the secret to success or failure. And essentially what I found was that foreign partners came into a joint venture with a certain set of skills. They took charge of the areas where those skills were relevant. They left everything else to their domestic partners. And really, throughout the life of their joint ventures, what you can see, it's not particularly easy to see from the graphs if you're a distance from them, is that essentially the foreign partner remained in exactly the same position from the start to the finish of their joint venture, and this is on average, and really learnt nothing about the areas such as security, government relations, tax, transport, where domestic skills are really very important. So there was this statistical evidence that foreign partners weren't really learning very much. However, on occasion, they did learn, they did make the effort to get involved, they did make the effort to acquire local knowledge, and when I did my statistical analysis, the only correlation between greater success and anything that foreign partners did was this active increase in participation and control in local knowledge issues. And there is a regression analysis that I did which showed the relationship between that competitive process and greater success. So essentially my conclusion was that, and is, that perhaps not surprisingly, you need to make an effort to get involved because you need to make sure that you maintain the balance in any relationship with your domestic partner. Just to encapsulate that in some kind of principles, just to underline the difficulties, deception is seen as a core skill. What you see is not what you get as a result. You're often led to believe that things are not, or you're led to believe that things are going well when they're not. You have to make a massive effort to understand what's really motivating your partner, what's really going on behind the scenes. You always need to cross-check. In fact, one Russian interviewee said, the classic phrase, you need to trust your domestic partner, but always check. And you need to be very persistent in making sure that you understand exactly what value you're bringing to a partnership and what value your domestic partner is bringing, and therefore you can protect yourself from the potential change in balance between the two. And we established that foreign companies in Russia have made a lot of consistent mistakes and will openly admit to these mistakes, overly relying on your domestic partner, believing you understood the complexity and ambiguity and not acknowledging that perhaps you don't know everything, not reading the runes correctly, not getting your intelligence right, sending the wrong people who are not of the high enough quality, and in particular, in many cases, who don't speak the language, which is absolutely vital. And I say complacency that once you're in and you've got a partnership, all is well with the world, when clearly it's an ongoing process. And I think TNK-BP, where Alistair worked, is a kind of very good example of how, over time, one major company went through a very, very volatile partnership, but ultimately came out at the other end with success, because eventually it kind of made the effort to understand really what was going on behind the scenes and got its strategy right. And BP went from choosing one oligarch in Russia back in the 1990s and finding it was a mistake, forming a partnership with another group of oligarchs at TNK, initially having great success with them as it brought lots of skills to bear at TNK-BP, and production increased and reserves increased and profits increased. But then, once its skills had done their job, if you like, an increasing period of conflict as the domestic shareholders felt that they weren't getting value for money, and BP increasingly felt that it wanted to diversify its partnership and looked at partnering with Gazprom. So big shareholder conflicts, recovery from that as the kind of corporate structure within TNK-BP allowed a kind of a resolution of the disputes, then another huge dispute as BP tried to form its partnership with Rosneft. Finally, once that partnership had been brought down by AAR's ability to use its influence within Russia to undermine the deal, a final strategy from BP, which was to threaten to sell up completely to a state company, leaving AAR in partnership with Rosneft, which was the last thing they wanted, and finally leading to an alignment of the partners and their ability to sell out together for what was a pretty extraordinary price of $55 billion. So very volatile, huge learning experience for BP. Many times during the process, they would now acknowledge they really didn't have enough information and didn't have enough understanding of what was really going on behind the scenes, but finally understood enough to be able to make a strategic choice about the sale process, which led them to them getting out in a pretty reasonable shape. In the book, what we try and say is there's a strategy which we've labelled the 7 R's engagement strategy. Essentially, what we're trying to say is that there are two elements to operating in partnership in Russia. One is to protect yourself by really trying to acquire as much local knowledge as you can, and that involves being realistic about what's really going on, being honest about your position, developing as many relationships as you possibly can, and doing it in a really rigorous fashion. It's a tough thing to do. And on the other side, because you're never going to really compete with a domestic partner in terms of interacting in an environment in which he is so comfortable and you are not, you need to do other things to maintain your relevance. And those include, reciprocity, offering assets outside the country to balance those that you hold inside, renewing your offer to the joint venture, finding new things that you can do with your partner to develop the partnership over a longer period of time, and importantly, sending the right people and leaving them there for the right amount of time. So this is kind of ways forward, if you like, for international companies in Russia. And so I guess to come back to, trying to put it all together, what I guess we're trying to say is that there's a lot of opportunity for international oil companies right now. They're very, very important potentially to the future of the Russian oil sector, and that has some interesting implications for potential sanctions in the very short term and for potential fostering of better relationships in the longer term. But despite those opportunities, there are clearly some very, very significant risks for international companies as they go forward in Russia. mainly centred on actually how they manage those partnerships. What we're seeing actually is that a number of the companies who are now involved in these partnerships, and I'd take Exxon as one very good example, do appear to have learned many of the lessons of the past 20 years and are implementing a lot of the strategies that we outline in the book. But nevertheless, as they go through the investment cycle, particularly in things like the Arctic, the risks will increase, and they will absolutely have to understand where they sit within the business and political environment and what value they're adding. And as a final note, I'd say I think that some of these topics are also relevant. I'm not going to talk now, but in the Q&A maybe we can get into, are relevant to the situation that we find ourselves with Russia and Ukraine now, in terms of understanding how we might interact to improve that situation. But anyway, I'll leave that for the Q&A. Thank you very much indeed.
James, thanks so much for very interesting presentation. What we'll do, I will kick up the discussion with a couple of questions, and then please feel free to line up behind the mic, introduce yourself, and we'll go from there. So I will start the question, I think, with everything most of us have in mind. Sanctions. I know you mentioned it, but I just came back from Moscow, and they're saying, "Oh, sanctions? It doesn't affect us." And I'm talking about energy sector. So, is it a bravado, or there is some effect you can see? And if yes, what is about existing GVs and about future GVs, about companies that are going to enter the market?
So I think the Russian perception of sanctions is that they see a number of things. One, it's difficult to envisage how short-term sanctions on energy could harm Russia more than they potentially would harm the people imposing the sanctions, particularly in Europe, especially as we move towards the winter. So I mean, it's difficult to conceive of a way that you could ignore Russian gas or ignore Russian oil without having a very dramatic impact on the markets in which they are supplied. And that impact would clearly undermine the economies in Europe and potentially the world, depending on what happens to the oil price. So I think they're quite sanguine. They can't quite understand how it would operate in the short term. I think the sanctions they are concerned about, and this is where I think the bravado comes in, is that they are concerned about financing, I think, even if they say they're not, because when you talk to individual companies, they are concerned about how they're going to raise money in the short term, both to finance their balance sheets and to finance specific projects like Yamal LNG, which has already been impacted by the withdrawal of US Exim Bank, and is having a harder time finding project financing, and is having to turn to markets such as those in Asia for much more money than they would like to do. I think the other thing where sanctions can have an impact, and although the impact physically is actually in the medium to longer term, I think the concern would come now is if we started to target some of the areas that I've talked about, which are going to be fundamental to the future maintenance of Russian oil production, which is absolutely vital to the economy and to the politicians. If, for example, transfer of technology was limited, I mean, if, heaven forbid, well, not heaven forbid, but if, which they're fighting against completely, Exxon was prevented from drilling the well in the Arctic, it would have a massive PR effect, and it would also cause Russia to really think about, what is the future impact on its oil industry, and that would be a concern in the short term, even though the effect would be in the longer term. Now, it's difficult to know exactly how much impact there would be. I mean, in terms of the Arctic, I think it would be significant, because I don't think that any Russian company would look to drill a well in the South China Sea without somebody very experienced next to it and operating the well. In terms of the unconventional, then it might be that they could find the drilling equipment from China, they could find some partners who would be prepared to operate with them. But I think it would definitely slow down the process of the development of unconventional. In enhanced oil recovery, probably less dramatic because there are service companies who would be prepared to offer the help required. But nevertheless, I think targeting that sort of technical support would be something that would be a concern. I think the Russians are sanguine about it because they know that the companies involved are lobbying incredibly hard for that not to happen. So they believe, I think, that there is a division within the corporate world and the political world in the international community, and also between individual countries in the international community who are trying to prevent those sanctions being imposed.
You know, you're saying that imagine drilling Arctic well without Exxon, but Gazprom Neft is actually drilling Arctic Prirazlomne.
Well, I think there's a vast difference between Prirazlomne and the South Kara Sea in terms of the environment. And also I think that Gazprom Neft, I mean, it is drilling that well, but the field development has been going on for some time. It's not been a success. In fact, I'd say it's been a catastrophic disaster commercially. You know, the process of developing Prirazlomne is a very good example of how not to go about developing an Arctic oil field. And if you looked at the economics of that since day one, it's been you know, a loss-making big problem, headache for anyone who's been involved in it. So I think, you know, it's why one can confidently say that I think, particularly in a harsher environment like the South Kara Sea, an even more environmentally sensitive environment like the South Kara Sea, and drilling an exploration well into, you know, a very, very expensive exploration well into what is not a low-risk prospect, is a different prospect than actually developing a field you already knew you had and have taken 10 or 15 years to do.
Okay. You also mentioned that tight oil, and especially Bazhenov, right now is high hopes for Russia, but there is not so much shale oil as oil shale, Karagan. And it's not clear, even like here in US, there is no real techniques how to develop it. So what do you think? It's just excitement, or there are real possibilities of development?
From the people I talk to, I think there are real possibilities. You're absolutely right. There is Karagan, but I think the resource base is so enormous that there certainly is potential. But I think again we're at a very early stage of understanding the rocks, and so the technical environment, and also then the commercial environment. And I think what is going to happen over the next couple of years is we are seeing Shell drilling with Gazprom Neft at the Salim project, and we're going to see Exxon and now Total and Statoil and BP drilling on various of the regions to really investigate, you know, what the prospectivity is. I think that, you know, companies like Sogut Neftegas and others have drilled into these layers before and have produced oil from them, so there's definitely some productivity, but how widespread it is, how heterogeneous it is, how much it will cost, what the flow rates will be, is very much up in the air, particularly as no one's really drilled a lot of horizontal wells and done a lot of multi-stage fracking. So I think we're not going to know what the real prospects are until probably 2016, and then there'll be a negotiation about what tax terms are needed to make those prospects economic. And so I think that, again, that whole process would be delayed if international companies were embargoed in any sense from getting involved in transferring technology, and any prospects of future production would be pushed back even further. And I think they're relatively uncertain now. That, you know, there's great hopes, but, you know, we'll see what happens. But certainly it'll take a lot longer to see what happens without international involvement.
There is a lot of talk right now about IOCs versus service companies, that basically like service companies taking place of IOC.
Yeah.
And we see it right now actually happening in Bazhenov, I believe. Russian companies make partnership GVs, forming not with IOCs, but with service companies like Schlumberger and Halberton. Do you see some competition here? And
No, definitely competition, and I think if there were, on the sanctions point, if there were going to be sanctions, it would be absolutely necessary, if they're going to work, that the service companies were involved. And it's a very grey area, because many of these service companies have acquired Russian service companies, put them under their umbrella, maintained them as Russian entities. I mean, Schlumberger went through a massive acquisition phase in the early 2000s, and so an interesting question as to where is the technology right now? Is it in Russia? Is it in foreign service companies? So yes, I mean it will be difficult, and I agree with you that service companies have a role to play. We've seen an example of that already in the 1990s, where they were actively involved in partnerships to redevelop brownfields. It was one of the reasons why IOCs were not as heavily involved in the Russian oil industry in the late 1990s. I think in the case of the tight oil, the unconventional oil, though, I mean, there already are these joint ventures. They're very extensive joint ventures. Future joint ventures may be limited by partnerships with
joint ventures with service companies.
But I think there is also the management of the process, which, as we know from the US experience, is an industrial process. It's drilling a lot of wells and doing a lot of interpretation and constantly adjusting your views on the reservoir and what you need to do. And I think right now, service companies can certainly provide some of that, but I think there is a management of the process, of the operational process, which also would benefit from IOC involvement, at least initially.
I see. I want to. Are you ready for? One last comment. Actually, I want to make a comment as a Russian, not as an expert. And you were talking about that partnership was not known in Russia at all, and it was basically absent. The concept of partnership was absent, and I kind of was struck by that, because I think, well, first, foreign companies came to a closed country. The country was closed for many years. Second, I think it's a cultural differences, because friendship, I mean, maybe versus partnership, but friendship is very valued in Russia. So it's like a different, and with a friend, you could form a company and go to business. With the partners, it was foreign. It was not clear what it is. So it just somehow...
No, I mean, when I talk about partnership, I mean it in the kind of... I don't mean that people didn't get together and do things as friends, as business associates, and formed companies. What I meant was that in an oil industry context, if you have an oil field in the North Sea, there's a very high probability that Exxon will own 35% of it and operate it. Shell will be 20% partner, BP will be a 20% partner, and a small independent will own, whatever the remaining percentage, 15% is. In Russia, there was no concept of that whatsoever. And if you look at Gazprom's or Rosneft's portfolio of fields, they will all be owned 100% by Rosneft. There was no Rosneft-Lukoil sharing of risk or reward. There was no. Right. So it was really that what I was talking about. So in that sense, there was no kind of commercial partnership between companies. Absolutely, I agree that there are partnerships in terms of amicable agreements between people to put companies together. Yeah.
And the last one, I promise. And when you're talking, you put a lot of emphasis on foreign partner relevance. My question is it just for any business, it's important to be relevant to your partner?
Yeah, it is. Of course, it is. I mean, and some of the statements one makes about Russia, one could make about other countries. So I'm not suggesting that Russia is unique, and you're right in any partnership. And of course, the theories that, or rather, the argument was developed from general joint venture theory, where competition for knowledge between partners goes on, and normally it is a competition for two different types of knowledge that are applied in terms of technical ability or operating ability or whatever. The point I was trying to make in Russia is that the competition is skewed because the domestic partner has this local knowledge, and which is kind of embedded in the kind of cultural and societal and business environment that's been developed over many, many years, and is a kind of an informal process, whereas what the foreign partners are bringing is a much more kind of technical and learnable, if you like, skill. And so therefore, and in a weak state environment, maintaining relevance therefore becomes much more of an issue for the foreign partner. So yes, it is true for all partnerships, but it's a much more complex process, I would argue, in Russia than it is, and in countries with weak institutional environments than it is perhaps in a kind of OECD, if I can put it like that, environment.
Okay, thanks. I'll pass you to the audience.
Okay.
Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Andrew Medvedev with Morgan Stanley Infrastructure. I guess my question is more around the natural gas value chain in Russia and what that means given the upcoming Russian glut. So as you talked about getting gas out of Russia, what do you think is the most effective way, whether it's Western LNG, Eastern LNG, pipeline projects, the new Chinese partnership, and within that, sort of why, right, costs and whatnot, and then what part of that value chain is most at risk and therefore most available to foreign partnerships? So for instance, if you need to get the gas from the North Siberian fields down to China for $10 delivered, does that mean the critical part of it is the new pipe? Is it the storage? Is it the terminaling infrastructure, the gathering fields? Where is that knowledge and technology most critical given where the gas is going to flow?
So I think...
And there's a lot there, so please.
Yeah, sure. So I think that in terms of this kind of traditional development of the gas sector in Russia, Gazprom's been doing it for years, is competent at doing it, has built vast pipelines from West Siberia to Europe, and is certainly capable of building a pipeline from East Siberia to China. So I don't think there's much value added in the actual operational process in any of those issues. I think that what Russia is experiencing right now is a need to compete in the global gas market, and that means being involved in pipeline value chains, which it's historically been very good at, and can produce very competitive gas. It may not price it competitively, but the cost of supply is actually quite low. But you also need flexibility, and the flexibility that is implied by being able to sell LNG as well, to access markets that you obviously couldn't supply with pipeline gas. And I think that's where the weakness, if you can call it that, lies. I mean, there's just not been much experience of developing LNG. Sakhalin 2 is the only project, and as I mentioned, that was really developed by Shell, not by Gazprom. So I think putting together LNG projects, and that's not just an ability to build a liquefaction plant. It's providing your customers with the confidence that that plant is going to come on stream on time, on budget, and that there's going to be a commercial rationale for it. And unfortunately, for Russian companies, and really for any new developers of LNG, customers and banks providing the financing like to see experienced players sitting in those projects. And so not only do you have the Russian political risk with any LNG project, you have the Russian companies who've never done this risk, therefore I'm not sure if it's going to happen or not risk. And it may or may not be justified. It's just a fact of life. So I think that that's where the weakness in the gas chain lies. And as Russia looks to emerge from its pipeline history into a more global gas industry kind of player, then that's where the opportunity is, I think, for international companies. Russia will learn for sure, but right now, at the start of the process, there's opportunity, I think.
My name is Akash Loos. I work here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. I have two questions, one related to gas and one related to oil. So my question related to gas is this. Eni and Gazprom has announced that they will switch their long-term gas contracts to spot gas indexation from oil indexation. Do you see this as a start of a trend, or is this a one and only act of Gazprom to use spot gas in its long-term European contracts? And in general, could you possibly comment on Gazprom's European marketing strategy? Are they looking at maintaining market share or maximizing revenues these days? My question related to oil is that some of the super majors are under tremendous pressure to cut back on expensive projects, reduce capex. So how do you see their operations in Russia in the context of these pressures to reduce capital expenditures? Thank you.
Okay. Interesting questions. So in terms of the ENI deal and the well, I mean, I think it's not been confirmed that the spot price is actually the basis, but I think there's a reasonable implication that it is. That reflects what I was trying to say, which is that Gazprom has been moving towards a more commercially oriented marketing strategy. And I think in terms of its overall marketing strategy in Europe, what we've seen is a realization that if it's not going to lose market share dramatically, and also if it's not going to generally discourage the use of gas in Europe, which is already under threat, it needs to find a pricing strategy that makes its gas competitive. And what we've seen since 2009, through a gradual series of renegotiations of the contract's base prices, of the offering of rebates to essentially equalize oil-linked contracts with hub prices, and also complete changes in marketing strategy, a move towards a realization that their prices have to reflect spot price levels. Now, this may be the first example, and it's only the language of the ENI statements which leads us to believe that it's now, as they put, fully reflects the market. Now, that may mean it's completely linked to spot prices, it may not, but what we can say is that all Gazprom's gas, or the average price for Gazprom gas sales into Europe now, does fully reflect the market, because the average price in 2013 was pretty much exactly the same as the hub price. And so Gazprom has changed its strategy, is adjusting its strategy, and I think one of the interesting commentaries on Gazprom's strategy is that historically, certainly at the Institute, we would argue it has acted as a discriminating monopolist. So it is in each market, and because it is 35 or 40 different markets, in each market it has picked a pricing strategy which it feels is relevant to that market. And what we're seeing in Western Europe, particularly Northwest Europe right now, is it has been forced by the market to adopt a strategy which either acknowledges spot prices completely or adjusts prices towards the market level. However, in other markets where there is either no linkage to European hubs or where there's no alternative energy supply, and Ukraine is obviously one very good example of that, and the Baltic states are another, it prices as it sees fit. And those prices happen to be rather high. But interestingly, what we've seen is those countries have not been able to find a cheaper alternative, so they still buy a lot of Russian gas. Now, that's slowly being broken down, particularly for the Baltic countries, by EU legislation, so that we're in a process where that is going to stop. But it's interesting that Gazprom has essentially adopted a very rational strategy in all its markets, and that strategy in Western Europe now is very much spot-related. In terms of the super majors and the pressure to reduce capex, I think they are under pressure, but I think the thing about Russia is the opportunity is so enormous that it's probably one of the few places in the world your investors would be prepared to see you spend money, assuming they were convinced that you had addressed the risk issues that I talked about. And I think investors are concerned about those risks and are being pressurized to ask companies about those risks and what they're doing to deal with them. And I think it's, interestingly, even organizations like Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund are addressing the pressure on the super majors from investors as a way of getting their views across. And I think it's an example of how the pressure is being applied. So I think, yes, there is pressure to consider whether you should be spending this much money in Russia. The opportunity to find a 7 billion barrel oil field is not that prevalent in the world. So I think the answer at the moment is yes, the balance is probably in favour of spending the money rather than not. But if the political or environmental or commercial risks changed from here, I think the question would still be asked, because it still is a vast amount of capex being 100% funded by international companies. Yeah, so I think it's a fair point.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anna Belova with Global Data, and I want to go back to the service company question and how the competition for knowledge model applies to the service companies. So we're going to see a one-way transfer of knowledge in terms of drilling techniques, horizontal drilling, fracking. enhanced oil recovery, only to be seen that knowledge transferred to Russian service companies, and in 20 years, it's NOCs who are the winners, and not IOCs or service companies, as what's implied.
So I think the service company model is just fundamentally different because the service companies don't want any access to the cash flows from the fields. It's purely a contractual agreement. So there's no implication that they should transfer knowledge at all. And in fact, they do their absolute level best not to transfer knowledge. And so I think that, in terms of domestic service companies, the issue for international service companies is as they form joint ventures or buy subsidiaries of domestic service companies, then they have to make very sure that they don't get disenfranchised. They tend to do that by buying 100% interest in the domestic company and not partnering. And the reason they can get away with that is because they're not buying any strategic assets in Russia. So there is an issue with oil companies being involved in a strategic industry and owning resources that are seen as not unnaturally belonging to the country, and therefore sharing those resources is a much bigger strategic issue than forming a joint venture or buying a domestic service company. But so I think that it's perfectly possible for Schlumberger to get involved in unconventional drilling without giving away the state secrets, as far as Schlumberger is concerned. However, over time, obviously, there is a learning process. So yes, and I think it's interesting, for example, that Rosneft has decided to restart its own in-house service company. And so I think, as if the national oil companies and any of the Russian oil companies start to do that, then there is a risk as a service company, if you go and provide the services and you're asked to work with an in-house service company, then there is a risk that you would transfer technology. So I think it is a risk that the Schlumbergers and Halliburtons of this world need to acknowledge. I just think it's a lower risk than for the international oil companies who are actually sharing in the cash flows.
Hi, I'm Howie Wan. I'm also an upstream analyst with Global Data. I have a quick question regarding the deal between Russia and China last week, about $400 billion, 38 billion cubic meters per year. That's 72% of China's net gas import in 2013. I think a lot of things regarding the deal is that the details are not public yet, so a lot of speculation about the pricing of the gas from $350 to $400 per 1,000 cubic meters. I'm just curious if you have any opinion regarding the pricing. And also the first delivery of the gas the earliest won't be like 2018. Apparently there are a lot of possibilities and obstacles in the delivery, such as the pipelines go through North Korea and everything. And besides the pricing, what would you see as the biggest hurdle in the delivery of this project?
I think that well, firstly, on the deal, my guess would be, well, obviously it hasn't been announced, but my guess would be that the price is around $385 a 1,000 cubic meters. If you take the total volume, right, rather than 38 BCM a year, if you just take the total volume that Miller said was going to be sold and divide by 400 million, you get to roughly that. Now, why am I confident that's the price? Well, only because I did some analysis back in 2011, 2012, which suggested that at that price, Gazprom can make an adequate rate of return, and that gas can then be competitive on the eastern seaboard of China. So I think it looks like the right price. Now, whether it's exactly 380 or 370 or 390, I don't know, but it's around that level and it makes sense. What's the biggest risk? The biggest risk is Gazprom's inefficiency to get things done, and potential cost overruns and delays, and the inability of domestic companies to provide the levels of pipe and other kit that is required. There is also an issue with helium production at the Chayanda field, which will be the first field to be developed, and also at Kavikta, and what they do with that helium, because as a strategic resource, they can't flare it off. They have to save it, and it's difficult to store it, and that could be an issue. So I think those are the two key issues. I mean, Gazprom has a pretty reasonable history of developing big fields and putting pipes in place. I mean, it hasn't done much of it since the Soviet era, but it did develop Zapolyanoye field in pretty reasonable shape, which produces more than 100 billion cubic meters a year now. It's Russia's biggest producing field. And so, China and Kavikta are difficult. There's infrastructure difficulties because they are very remote fields. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were delays, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were cost overruns. But I think it is now far too important a project not to happen. I suspect 2018 is too optimistic for first gas. I suspect it'll be 2019 or 2020. I think the other risk is that I'd be very interested to see how long the agreement lasts and its current form, and whether China decides to renegotiate, because it's in a pretty powerful position. But I think in terms of just the physical details. Also, I think that the other point to make about the deal is that although it is 72% of Chinese gas imports now, if China achieves its goals, it will actually only be 10% of Chinese supply, not imports, but of supply. And so I don't think it's a very logical diversification for China, I think. It makes sense for them to do this deal. It makes sense for Russia to do this deal. And so I think it will stick as a deal. So I don't think there's a commercial risk, but I acknowledge the risk of overrun and delay.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Eric Aznaurian. I'm doing biotechnology at Columbia. So I don't have much of an economic or energy background, so my question might be not right. But do you feel that the value of dollar may diminish if countries like Russia and China start to trade in their own currencies more, especially, oil and gas? And also, if other countries join them in this process and start to trade in their own currencies, or maybe in Russian currency or Chinese currency, and will it eventually lead to a new reserve currency based on oil, or supported by price of oil?
No, interestingly, I have a friend who placed a very large bet that the dollar would no longer be a reserve currency, and he bought a lot of gold on the back of that, and actually, by fortune, made a lot of money, because during the economic crisis, obviously, the price of gold went up a lot. But as to whether the oil would ever become the foundation for a reserve currency, I think not, because there's far too much politics involved in its pricing, and there's far too much uncertainty about, it is a finite resource as well. So, that would not inspire much confidence in the market. However, having said that, it is interesting that countries are starting to do deals in local currencies. It certainly undermines, to an extent, not the value of the dollar, but the importance of the dollar. I think the only thing I'd say to mitigate that is that when you're looking to raise financing, banks don't tend to want to see you taking big currency risk, because obviously that skews potentially the economics of the project they're offering you loans for. And historically, oil is priced in dollars and will continue to have a dollar component for many, many years to come, if not forever. And so balancing that currency risk for financiers may be a bit of an issue. However, it's something they may have to just learn to live with as deals like this become more prevalent, and as Asian economies grow and start to consume a greater share of the world's hydrocarbon output. I agree, it could be an influence. On this particular deal, just to put it into context, though, the China-Russia deal is the equivalent of Russian sales to Germany. So it's big, but it's not big enough to make a huge difference. However, if in 10 years' time, Russia builds another pipeline, Russia starts to sell LNG into Asia, and its Asian and European components of its hydrocarbon exports start to balance themselves out, then it's a different story. So I think it's something for the longer term to consider. I think right now it's not something that's going to have a massive influence.
Good evening. Paul Marino here from YPFP in New York. I wonder if you could speak more about your forecast for Arctic development in the next 10, 20 years. Do you foresee the need for more state development to make the markets more cost-effective for investment and development? And secondly, could you respond to the news item of China last week with their intention to build tunnels spanning the Bering Strait? In your opinion, is that a feasible project for the long term? Does Russia view it as interesting and useful? And will the larger oil and gas companies view that kind of approach as worth investing in?
Sorry, just remind me of the first. I was too focused on the tunnels in the Bering Strait. I forgot the first question.
Well, the Bering Strait tunnels in the Arctic. So the idea is your forecast for the next 10 to 20 years of development in the Arctic.
Yeah.
What kind of participation is needed, not just from the private sector, from government to make it more feasible. And in that context, the Chinese government has offered this rail project. And I was curious, from your expertise in oil and gas and in Russia, are they supportive of this in Russia? And also, are the oil and gas majors supportive, maybe not financially, but politically? Will they help or participate in it?
Okay, so I think in terms of the second question, I'm not aware of any particular response to that offer at the moment, so I couldn't really give you a sort of genuine view on that. In terms of the development of the Arctic, I think that Arctic development will essentially come down to the commercial reality. I don't think it's important enough to merit state sponsorship. I think the Russian government is creating a tax environment in which it can happen. So if that's government support, I mean, it's not really government support because its motivation is to generate future revenue and to get people to invest so they can make a profit and the government can make a tax take in the future. So I think it's going to come down to private companies. I think the key element is going to be what the oil price is going to be, and that's going to be to do with what happens to oil demand, which may start to go into decline. It's going to come down to what alternative sources of oil supply there are. I mean, will unconventional oil in the US continue on its upward trend? Will unconventional oil elsewhere in the world at lower cost than Arctic oil be developed? I think that the high cost of Arctic development does put it under threat, and I think that there is a significant question mark about whether it will really make sense in anything other than the very long term. And I think that's a question that Exxon in particular will be very, very focused on as it assesses the results of its drilling, even if it's successful. I mean, I would say, just to reiterate, I think gas is just a non-starter. If they find gas, they're going to leave it there for way beyond all our lifetimes. If they find oil, then there's a tax regime now which can guarantee them a 22% rate of return, which is a reasonable rate of return, although the risks are pretty high. But then there are just the physical issues of getting the project done in the ice and the cold and the remoteness of the area. And then there's the environmental issues, which are actually very, very important. I mean, and are going to be a huge concern. I think the Russians, despite their reputation for being slightly lackadaisical about the environment, actually, have got it. Certainly do not want to spoil what is essentially a national reserve. And I think Greenpeace and others have highlighted what the risks are. And I think the international companies particularly are absolutely aware that this could be a literally company-ending event. If they have an oil spill in the Arctic, even a company like ExxonMobil may never recover from it, given what happened to BP and Macondo in the Gulf. Because in the Arctic environment, the oil is not going to disperse rapidly like it did in the Gulf. So I think that all those issues will come into play once an oil discovery has been made, and obviously that's an uncertainty at the moment. But if it is made, then I think there is still some doubt as to whether the Arctic development is a no-brainer or whether it's something that may have to wait until there's more certainty on a number of issues.
Hi, James. It's Ian Nathan from Energy Intelligence. Terrific talk, by the way, so thank you. Just going back to something you mentioned earlier a number of times, which is Russian gas competitiveness. And actually, I think I read it, I think previously in I think one of your papers, but I'm trying to wrap my head around the notion that with incremental supply in the Yamal Peninsula being particularly high cost, and traditional sources diminishing, traditional, I guess at this point, low-cost sources diminishing. But you're suggesting that Gazprom's overall cost basis is still very competitive, I guess, production costs.
Yeah.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about this and try and reconcile that? Because I'm also thinking in terms of say, compared to, say, Novatek and its, liquids-rich production, how does Gazprom compare in that regard?
Sure. Yeah. There's an interesting kind of dichotomy. I mean, when I say high cost, what I mean is high cost in a Russian context. So you're absolutely right to say that Novatek's and a lot of the non-Gazprom production, the reason why we've seen such a rapid growth in non-Gazprom production is because relative to Gazprom's marginal cost, well, not marginal cost, sort of higher cost fields, it is very competitive. And Gazprom's overall average cost is rising as it moves away from its core West Siberian fields into these new developments. So, and the liquids component in Novatek's gas particularly has made it able to offer very low prices. So in domestic context, Gazprom is losing market share very rapidly. However, in an international context, Russian gas is not overall uncompetitive, and even Gazprom's most expensive gas, because of the size of the fields, because of the relatively easy nature of the developments, the low, shallow reservoirs, and the major cost is the transportation cost. But I calculate, and others have kind of calculated, that in a delivered cost of Yamal gas to Europe is about $8 an MMBTU to the German border, cost of delivery. Now, that implies a cost of delivery into Moscow, which is not actually particularly competitive because Novatek's gas is so cheap, but it doesn't mean that by the time it gets to Europe, given where European prices are relative to Russian prices, it can't be competitive. And I think the problem that Russia's had and Gazprom's had is it hasn't obviously sold its gas at anywhere near cost. It's obviously tried to maximize profits, and that has led to oil-linked pricing, et cetera, et cetera. But going forward, it's perfectly conceivable that Gazprom could essentially outcompete anything that Europe can be offered by anyone, including the US.
And just a quick follow-up is that just with regard to an increasingly competitive European market, where ostensibly prices can come down, remain even lower than they have been, increasing hub price discovery. This to me becomes a problem. I mean, not again, as the Asian context is one thing, that's fine, separate issue. But in a competitive European market, it seems to me that would require Gazprom to make sure that its gas can compete much better than perhaps it can now under current conditions.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think where spot prices now in Europe are down, below that level. I mean, they're below 750. I mean, but that's a kind of one-off because of warm weather and storage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No, I think you're right. I mean, I think Gazprom is in the process of developing its European marketing strategy, and there are very different views in Moscow and in London, where Gazprom Marketing and Trading sit. And Gazprom Marketing and Trading in London are very keen to actively participate in the European market and to trade on hubs, to use Gazprom's rather powerful position as a relatively low-cost supplier, and to A, trade between the volatility between winter and summer, B, start charging for flexibility, and act as an active market participant. That people in Moscow are not so keen on that. There's it seems to be a psychological issue, a fundamental belief in oil-linked pricing. So that is going to be an issue, and the Gazprom is kind of evolving its strategy as we speak. But I think that it's being forced to do that by things like the potential emergence of US LNG into Europe. And it's interesting that very specifically on that issue, Alexander Medvedev, the head of the Gazprom export business, has said, we will compete with US LNG when it arrives. And it looks like they are prepared to do that. And the only way to do that is to do what we were talking about earlier, which is to make your contracts fully reflect market conditions, whatever that may mean, but very probably with a significant element of spot price in the contract. And I think that's the way we are heading inevitably in the markets where there is genuine competition. So I think that it is a potential problem for Russia, but I think they are very confident that we will not see a surge, the surge of new projects that is forecast. They're very confident that US LNG will find a market in Asia, not Europe. I think the major risk for Gazprom actually in Europe is that not necessarily alternative gas supplies, but alternative energy supplies full stop actually undermine the gas market as a whole and leave them rather disadvantaged. And, I'm talking about coal, I'm talking about subsidised renewables, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, no, I mean, all those issues are definitely, concerning Gazprom at the moment.
We have to, James, many thanks, but we have to wrap up our session. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and thanks for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.